I wandered to a crude coast like a ghost. Upon the hills I saw fires, funeral pyres seemingly, and heard breaking waves like distant cannonades that set the land shaking.
Hardy's Wessex, a journey through a partly real, partly dream country, presented by Desmond Hawkins, with Nigel Stock as Thomas Hardy.
It's customary to think of Hardy as a country writer, concentrating on a rural scene of farmhouses and cottages and sleepy market towns. But just take a look at the map of his Wessex, and you realize that none of it is very far from salt water. In fact, if you draw a defensive arc from Gloucester to Southampton, and that's no great distance, you'll complete the maritime nature of this southwest peninsula as an island with hundreds of miles of coastline. For the people of Wessex, the waters of the Western Ocean have been their living, their adventure, and their peril. To go to sea from a Devon farm or a Dorset village was no great step and no surprise. At this moment, I'm high above Weymouth harbour, on the North Fort. If I turn to the south behind me, I can see Portland, that Gibraltar of Wessex, Hardy called it, linked to the mainland by the Chesil Beach. This fort I'm standing on was built in 1872, presumably in case of any further trouble with the French. Memories of Napoleon's threats weren't easily forgotten. In 1804, Hardy's grandfather had been a trooper in the local volunteers, the Dad's Army of those days, when a false alarm announced that Napoleon's invasion of Weymouth Bay had begun. Another grandfather, was it perhaps the same one, the fictitious Grandfer Cantle, in The Return of the Native? He also was in the local volunteers at Weymouth, or at Budmouth, as Hardy calls it.
In the year 4, 'twas said there wasn't a finer figure in the whole of South Wessex than I, as I looked when dashing past the shop windows with the rest of our company on the day we ran out of Budmouth, 'cause it was thoughted that Boney had landed round the point.
Hardy was born only 25 years after the final defeat of Bonaparte at Waterloo, and the threat of a Napoleonic invasion was still a vivid family memory and a powerful influence on his writing. In The Trumpet Major, and again in The Dynasts, he shows the coast of South Wessex on guard against an imminent attack by the French. So he'd have understood well enough the original purpose of this old fort, which today is just a pleasant museum piece for holidaymakers to visit. And he'd also recall the times when the tide of war flowed in the opposite direction, and it was British soldiers who passed through the Wessex ports to cross the Channel to France. At the end of August 1914, when the Germans were already threatening Paris, Hardy wrote to his friend Edward Clodd,
"Trifling incidents here bring home to us the condition of affairs not far off, as I dare say they do to you still more. Sentries with gleaming bayonets at unexpected places as we motor along. The steady flow of soldiers through here to Weymouth, and their disappearance across the Channel in the silence of night."
It was as if the Budmouth that he'd described in the Dynasts had come to life again, with the troopers and the Trumpet Major sailing out of this harbour below me and taking with them the fond souvenirs of peacetime.
When we lay where Budmouth Beach is, oh, the girls were fresh as peaches, with their tall and tossing figures and their eyes of blue and brown. And our hearts would ache with longing as we paced from our sing-songing with a smart clink-clink up the esplanade and down. They distracted and delayed us by the pleasant pranks they played us. And what marvel then, if troopers, even of regiments of renown, on whom flashed those eyes divine, oh, should forget the countersign, oh, as we tore clink, clink, back to camp above the town. Do they miss us much, I wonder, now that war has swept us sunder, and we roam from where the faces smile to where the faces frown, and no more behold the features of the fair fantastic creatures, and no more clink, clink, past the parlors of the town? Shall we once again there meet them, falter fond attempts to greet them? Will the gay sling jacket glow again beside the muslin gown? Will they archly quiz and con us with a sideway glance upon us, while our spurs clink, clink up the esplanade and down?
Hardy had known Weymouth from his boyhood days. It's only a dozen miles or so from the family home, and when Hardy's father had to drive into Weymouth on business, he took young Thomas with him as a treat, which he let him play on the beach for a bit. And later, as a young man, Hardy was employed by a Weymouth architect, and he came to live here in Diggs, up in Wupperton Street over there, just behind the Gloucester Hotel, or the Gloucester Lodge as it was originally. And the architect's office where he worked, that was in the street that starts by that colourful statue of George III, which is one of the sights of Weymouth. The mere mention of Gloucester Lodge and George III lights up the essential history of Weymouth. It was His Royal Highness, the Duke of Gloucester, who came here in about 1780 with the outlandish idea that bathing in seawater was good for one's health. Well, it evidently did him a power of good, because he built Gloucester Lodge and he persuaded the King and Queen to come to Weymouth and take a dip as he had done in 1789. Thanks to George III, Weymouth can claim to be Britain's first seaside resort. With less ceremony, Hardy himself used to enjoy a swim in the bay after he took up his appointment with the local architect, Mr. Crickmay, in 1869.
I now became resident at Weymouth and took lodgings there, rowing in the bay almost every evening of this summer and bathing at 7 in the morning either on the pebble beach towards Preston or diving off from a boat. Being, like the poet Swinburne, a swimmer, I would lie a long time on my back on the surface of the waves, rising and falling with the tide in the warmth of the morning sun. After the enervation of London, this tonic existence by the sea seemed ideal.
As I look now at the magnificent sweep of Weymouth Bay, I can well understand the pleasure Hardy found here. Of all the towns of Wessex, it's second only to Dorchester, or Casterbridge as he called it, in its prominence in his writing, and for a very good reason that he himself expressed in his account of Weymouth as he knew it in his early years.
Between 1840 and 1850, the old watering place, herein called Budmouth, still retains sufficient afterglow from its Georgian gaiety and prestige to lend it an absorbing attractiveness to the romantic and imaginative soul of a lonely dweller inland.
To the natives of rural Dorset, it was what Blackpool became to the mill towns of Lancashire. The Reddle man, Diggory Venn, in The Return of the Native, catches perfectly the mood of excitement and adventure.
In my travels, I go near Budmouth. Now, Budmouth is a wonderful place. Wonderful. A great salt sheening sea bending into the land like a bow. Thousands of gentle people walking up and down, bands of music playing, officers by sea and officers by land, walking among the rest. Out of every 10 folk you meet, 9 of them in love.
As a young bachelor, Hardy responded to this romantic atmosphere. In his first published novel, Desperate Remedies, the young lovers meet on a paddle steamer from Lulworth Cove to Weymouth, and their romance develops in their outings in a rowing boat here on the bay, sometimes with the girl's brother and sometimes not. And then in one of his poems, one called Singing Lovers, Hardy picks up the same theme.
I rode. The dimpled tide was at the turn, and mirth and moonlight spread upon the bay. There were 2 singing lovers in the stern, but mine had gone away. Whither, I shun to say. The houses stood confronting us afar, a livid line against the evening glare. The small lamps lightened, then out stole a star. But my love was not there. Vanished, I sorrowed where. His arm was round her, both full facing me with no reserve. Theirs was not love to hide. He held one tiller rope, the other she. I pulled, the merest glide, looked on at them, and sighed. The moon's glassed glory heaved as we lay swinging upon the undulations. Shoreward, slow, the plash of pebbles joined the lovers singing. But she, of a bygone vow, joined in the song, not now.
Hardy certainly had his own experiences of falling in love and out of love at Weymouth. In fact, he found his life here at times too exciting for a writer who wanted to get on with his writing, and at such times he preferred the peace and quiet of his parents' cottage at Bockhampton.
At the beginning of February 1870, I gave up my rooms in Weymouth and returned to my rural home to be able to concentrate more particularly on the manuscript than I could do in a lively town and as a member of a dancing class where a good deal of flirtation went on. This so-called class was, in fact, a gay gathering for dances and love-making by adepts of both sexes.
For all its distractions, Weymouth enlarged Hardy's experience and it enriched his writing. Among the poems he wrote here, the one that he called On the Esplanade captures the emotional intensity of a young man such as himself on a fine summer's evening, standing over there on the Esplanade, watching the paddle steamer from Lulworth crossing the bay, with people dancing on the deck to harp and violin, just as he describes in Desperate Remedies, and wondering now what life has in store for him next.
The broad, bald moon edged up where the sea was wide, mild, mellow-faced. Beneath, a tumbling twinkle of shines, light dyed, a trackway traced to the shore, as of petals fallen from a rose to waste in its overglow, and fluttering afloat on inward heaves of the tide. All this so plain, yet the rest I did not know. The horizon gets lost in a mist new-wrought by the night. The lamps of the bay that reach from behind me round to the left and right on the sea-wall way for a constant mile of curve make a long display as a pearl-strung row, under which in the waves they bore their gimlets of light. All this was plain, but there was a thing not so. Inside a window, open with undrawn blind, there plays and sings a lady unseen, a melody undefined, and where the moon flings its shimmer, a vessel crosses, whereon to the strings plucked sweetly and low of a harp, they dance. Yes, such did I mark, that behind my fate's masked face crept near me, I did not know.
The form that his fate took was, at first sight, a very prosaic one. It came as a letter from the Weymouth architect only days after Hardy had given up his lodgings in the town and gone home.
I had not been in the seclusion of my mother's house more than a week when I received the following letter from Mr. Quickmay.
Dear Sir, can you go into Cornwall for me to take a plan and particulars of a church I am about to rebuild there? It must be done early next week, and I should be glad to see you on Monday morning. Yours truly, G.R. Quickmay.
This was the church of St. Juliot, near Boscastle, of which I had vaguely heard as being likely to turn up for manipulation, and I had been struck by its romantic sound. Despite the somewhat urgent summons, I declined the job. The moment was inconvenient with a new novel in hand. I received a more persuasive request from Quickmay later, and having finished the manuscript of Desperate Remedies, except the 3 or 4 final chapters, by the beginning of March, I agreed to go on the errand.
Though the distance was not great, the way was tedious, there being few railways in Cornwall at this date. Rising at 4 in the morning and starting by starlight, armed with sketchbook, measuring tape and rule, I did not reach Launceston till 4 in the afternoon, where I hired a conveyance for the additional 16 or 17 miles distance by the Boscastle Road towards the north coast and the spot with the charming name, the dilapidated church, parish and residence of the Reverend Cattle Holder.
For Hardy, it was to be a momentous journey to what he always thought of as the romantic Celtic land of legend that he gave the name of Lyonesse.
When I set out for Lyonesse, 100 miles away, the Rhine was on the spray, and starlight lit my lonesomeness when I set out for Lyonesse, 100 miles away. What would bechance at Lyonesse while I should sojourn there? No prophet durst declare, nor did the wisest wizard guess what would bechance at Lyonesse while I should sojourn there. When I came back from Lyonesse with magic in my eyes, all marked with mute surmise my radiance rare and fathomless, when I came back from Lyonesse with magic in my eyes.
To find the church with the romantic sounding name, I too set off to Lyonesse, and so now I'm in the vicinity of Boscastle, walking along a little road, well, it's not much more than a lane really, which leads you up to the church of St. Juliot. It's one of those Cornish lanes with high banks, a lot of wildflowers. It's a very, very pretty scene. I'm just approaching the old rectory. That was Hardy's destination. But it's not, of course, a rectory anymore. It's now a private house. But in 1870, the Reverend Cattle Holder lived here with his wife and his wife's unmarried sister, Emma Gifford. And it was Emma who wrote this description of St. Juliot.
It was a very poor parish, and the church had been a long while out of repair for want of funds. The patron lived abroad. The tower went on cracking from year to year, and the bells, which should be dismantled for safety, remained in little north transept, their mouths open upward. The carved bench ends rotted more and more. The ivy hung gaily from the roof timbers, and the birds and the bats had a good time up there unmolested. No one seemed to care. The architect continued delaying to send his head man to begin operations, though my sister was active in the matter, both patron and architect getting urgent appeals from her, till it was decided at last to commence. All were delighted. I must confess to a curiosity started by the coming event as to what the architect would be like. It was a lovely Monday evening in March, after a wild winter, and we were on the quay bee for the stranger, who would have a tedious journey, his home being 2 counties off. The only damper to our gladness was the sudden laying up of my brother-in-law by gout. He, who was the chief person, could not be present on the arrival of our guest. The dinner cloth was laid. My sister had gone to her husband, who required the constant attention of his wife. At that very moment, the front door bell rang. I had to receive him alone.
That first dramatic meeting started an immediate romance which made them man and wife and inspired some of the most remarkable love poetry in the English language. For Hardy, this encounter at the rectory was so unexpected. When he started his journey, he believed he was in love with a dark-haired girl who lived in a city. But as he approached St. Juliot, a prophetic voice in the wind seemed to contradict him in every detail.
I travel on by barren farms, and gulls glint out like silver flecks against a cloud that speaks of wrecks, and bellies down with black alarms. I say, thus from my lady's arms I go. Those arms I love the best. The wind replies from dip and rise, nay, toward her arms thou journeyest. A distant verge morosely grey appears, while clots of flying foam break from its muddy monochrome, and a light blinks up far away. I say, my eyes now, as all day, behold her ebon loops of hair. Like bursting bombs the wind responds, nay, wait for tresses flashing fair. Yonder the headland, vulturine, snores like old Scrimer in his sleep, and every chasm and every steep blackens as wakes each Pharos shine. I roam, but one is safely mine, I say. God grant she stay my own. Low laughs the wind as if it grinned. Thy love is one thou'st not yet known.
On that grey night of mournful drone, apart from aught to hear, to see, I dreamt not that from shires unknown, in gloom alone by Hallworthy, a man was drawing near to me. I'd no concern at anything, no sense of coming pull-heart play. Yet under the silent outspreading of Even's wing, where Otterham lay, a man was riding up my way. There was no light at all inland, only the seaward Pharos fire, nothing to let me understand that hard at hand, by Hennet Byre, the man was getting nigh and nigher. There was a rumble at the door, a draught disturbed the drapery, and but a minute passed before, with gaze that bore my destiny, the man revealed himself to me.
The notes that Hardy made at the time of his arrival at St. Juliot are brief and undemonstrative. Looking through them, many years later, he made these comments.
I was soon, if not immediately, struck by the nature and appearance of the lady who received me. She was so living, I used to say. Though her features were not regular, her complexion at this date was perfect in hue, her figure and movement graceful, and her corn-coloured hair abundant in its coils.
However, he'd come to do a job of work. He spent all the first day in the church, drawing, measuring, with intervals for meals at the rectory. And next day he went to the slate quarries at Penpethy to see about slates for the church roof. But there were other excursions, of course, of a less businesslike sort on this occasion, and also when he came back again in the summer. He and Emma both enjoyed sketching, and in their courting days they'd pack up a picnic lunch, take their sketching materials with them, and set off for the day together. I'm going to follow a favourite excursion of theirs through the churchyard and down into the Valency Valley. I'm meeting the rector in the church later, so I won't go in now, but I can have a first impression of it. The square tower, that's part of Hardy's design because we know that the old one was demolished. The churchyard itself, well, that's much as Hardy described it in his novel, A Pair of Blue Eyes. There's the slate stile that you must clamber over and the low wall which is overtopped in its general level to the graves. But there's one big difference. He described it as treeless, with nothing growing except grey-green grass. Well, perhaps that's poetic license. I'm standing beside several fine trees, There's even a rook's nest up in the top I can see, and the ground's full of springtime colour, bluebells and red campion particularly. It really does look lovely. The Valency is a little river that comes tumbling down from the high moors and flows through a deep wooded valley into Boscastle. That was a favourite memory of Emma's.
Often we walked down the beautiful valley to Boscastle Harbour, where we had to jump over stones and climb over a low wall by rough steps, get through by narrow pathways to come out on great wide spaces suddenly, with a sparkling little brook going the same way, into which we once lost a tiny picnic tumbler, and there it is to this day, no doubt.
Well, I've come scrambling down the steep side of the valley through a dense woodland with the music of the stream gradually sounding louder. It really is an enchanted spot. On either side, the hills rear up shaggy and golden with gorse bushes, and then up on the high ground, the mark of the gale stormy sou'wester is sculpted on the trees. It stunts them and it bends them all along this exposed coast. But as you go down into the valley, you've got soft greenery, many trees, a profusion of wildflowers. Just now the ramson's out already, a lot of bluebells, some campion, and yet it's the green you come back to, the green of the grass and the green of the leaves. It really is beautiful. I've come to a little wooden bridge over the Valency River, and as I look now upstream and down, I can see how the boulders in the riverbed make a series of waterfalls. Sometimes the water tumbles over a rock into quite a deep pool. That picnic tumbler, I suppose, must still be in one of them. Hardy made a sketch of Emma at the time while she was kneeling down with her sleeve rolled up, trying to fish it out again, but she couldn't reach it. Many years later, he wrote a poem in which he personates Emma, as she might be in after years, remembering this moment and recalling the feeling that it brings back to her.
Whenever I plunge my arm like this in a basin of water, I never miss the sweet, sharp sense of a fugitive day, fetched back from its thickening shroud of grey. Hence the only prime and real love rhyme that I know by heart and that leaves no smart is the purl of a little valley fall, about 3 spans wide and 2 spans tall, over a table of solid rock, and into a scoop of the self-same block. The pearl of a runlet that will not cease in stir of kingdom, in war, in peace. With a hollow, boiling voice it speaks, and has spoken since hills were turfless peaks. Under the fall, in a crease of the stone, though where precisely none ever has known, jammed darkly, nothing to show how prized, and by now with its smoothness opalized, is a drinking glass. For down that pass, my lover and I walked under a sky of blue, with a leaf-wove awning of green, in the burn of August, to paint the scene. And we placed the basket of fruit and wine by the runlet's rim, where we sat to dine. And when we had drunk from the glass together, arched by the oak copse from the weather, I held the vessel to rinse in the fall, where it slipped and sank, and was past recall, though we stooped and plumbed the little abyss with long bared arms. There the glass still is, and, as said, if I thrust my arm below cold water in basin or bowl, a throw from the past awakens a sense of that time, and the glass we use, and the cascades rhyme. The basin seems the pool, and its edge the hard, smooth face of the brookside ledge, and the leafy pattern of chinaware, the hanging plants that were bathing there. By night, by day, when it shines or lowers, there lies intact that chalice of ours, and its presence adds to the rhyme of love persistently sung by the fall above. No lip has touched it since his and mine, in turns therefrom, sipped lovers' wine.
In the same month of August, 1870, Hardy saw the last of St. Juliot Church in its original condition. His plans for its restoration were ready for the work to begin.
The local builder laid hands on it and razed to the ground the tower and the north aisle and the transept. I much regretted the obliteration in this manner of the church's history. Yet the decision to alter and diminish its area had been come to before I arrived on the scene. What else could be done with the dilapidated structure was difficult to say if it had to be retained for use. The old walls of the former nave, dating from Norman or even earlier times, might possibly have been preserved. Fortunately, the old south aisle was kept intact with its arcade, the aisle now being adapted for a nave.
I'm in that south aisle, looking up at the impressive timber roof, and that was certainly worth saving. So was the arcade with its handsome archways. In front of me is the chancel screen, and that recalls a story that Hardy told about the day when he came here to see the completed restoration.
I had made a careful drawing of the old chancel screen with its decayed tracery, posts and gilding, and I had marked thereon where sundry patchings and scarpings were to be applied. Reaching the building one day, I found a new and highly varnished travesty of the old screen standing in its place. In answer to my astonished inquiries, the builder replied, "Well, Mr. Hardy," I said to myself, "I won't stand on a pound or two while I'm about it. I'll give 'em a new screen instead of that patched-up old thing."
The whole of the interior is looking very well just now. In fact, it's been redecorated this year. Oh, that'll be the rector now, David Nash. David, hello there.
Oh, hello there.
I've just been having a look around.
Nice to see you again.
Now, you're not only, of course, rector of St. Juliet nowadays, because the rectory is closed here, isn't it?
It is, yes.
You have more to cope with.
We
Cross
have
country?
seven churches all told, and this keeps us pretty busy.
It must do. When Hardy was here, when Emma was living in the rectory, the rector then, cattle holder, this was his sole concern, wasn't it?
And he only had about 4 baptisms a year on average in the 20 years he was here, and as many funerals, which says something about the population.
Yes.
And he had about 1 wedding a year,
Yes.
and the rest of the time was his own. Well, that's being a bit unfair, because he was quite a pioneer. He's responsible for the little school being built at the early part of his 20 years.
Yes.
He came almost too late to get an education grant. He fought fiendishly to get it and managed to get enough backing for the school to be opened. And this was his first sort of crowning glory. But of course, by the time Hardy came on the scene, he was quite an elderly man.
Yes.
His wife was less than half his age.
Yes.
And I rather like the picture of him being in bed at the time Hardy knocks at the door and suffering with gout, but it wasn't gout so bad that he couldn't get up and take a funeral the next day, which, rather suggests that those who make out he was trying to put Emma Gifford, his sister-in-law, alongside Thomas Hardy on their own might have something in it.
Yes. Yes.
There are lots of people, Desmond, who tend to put Hardy in amongst all those heartless Victorians who, although they restored churches, were looked upon as destroyers. But the word on Hardy's memorial there, saying that he assisted in the alterations, is rather a pointed word, because I think Hardy himself went on record as showing that he wasn't very keen in what he had to do, but the old nave was a complete ruin when he came here, and he wasn't an iconoclast. The fact that he drew the bench ends and some of the drawings that he did, which you can see on the wall there, and shows how he was a preserver rather than a destroyer. And those things that are said sometimes about him, I think, are unkindly oblivious to the fact that he was, after all, an assistant to his boss in Weymouth, and came here under his direction and did the best he could with the money available.
1913 was the year when, for the first time since his marriage, Hardy came back to St. Juliot. Emma had died a few months earlier. Plunged now into a mood of grief and remorse, he felt that her spirit was calling him back to Lioness, and under the spell of that old magic he wrote the poem After a Journey.
Here too I come to view a voiceless ghost. Whither, oh whither, will its wind now draw me? Up the cliff, down, till I'm lonely, lost, and the unseen water's ejaculations all. Where you will next be, there's no knowing, facing round about me everywhere, with your nut-coloured hair, and grey eyes, and rose flush coming and going. Yes, I have re-entered your olden haunts at last. Through the years, through the dead scenes I have tracked you. What have you now found to say of our past, scanned across the dark space wherein I have left you? Summer gave us sweets, but autumn wrought division. Things were not lastly, as firstly, well with us twain, you tell. But all's closed now, despite time's division. I see what you are doing. You are leading me on to the spots we knew when we haunted here together. The waterfall, above which the mist bow shone, at the then fair hour, in the then fair weather, and the cave just under, with a voice still so hollow that it seems to call out to me from 40 years ago, when you were all aglow, and not the thin ghost that I now frailly follow. Ignorant of what there is flitting here to see, the waked birds preen and the seals flop lazily. Soon you will have, dear, to vanish from me. The stars close their shutters, and the dawn whitens hazily. Trust me, I mind not, though life flowers, the bringing me here. Nay, bring me here again. I am just the same as when our days were a joy and our paths through flowers.
Now, revisiting the church, Hardy saw for the first time the memorial plaque to the rector he'd known, Cadell Holder, Emma's brother-in-law. Up there on the wall it is. And he decided that he'd put up another to match it exactly, one to Emma. And now today there's a third one to Hardy himself. He left detailed instructions for it to be put in hand after his death, so that his name and Emma's would be remembered here in St. Juliot Church, side by side. When he set out for Lioness in 1913 in his bereavement, he didn't at first realize how deeply these scenes of his early romantic days were going to affect him.
The visit to this neighborhood has been a very painful one to me, and I have said a dozen times I wish I had not come. What possessed me to do it? Looking back, it has seemed such a cruel thing altogether that events which began so auspiciously should have turned out as they did.
Among the old haunts he revisited, none could move him more than this cliff top where I'm standing now, looking out over the wide Atlantic, Beanie Cliff, the cliff that He portrayed in the novel a pair of blue eyes and called it The Cliff Without a Name. Up here, Emma rode her pony in her fearless, impetuous fashion, or she sat as a subject for Hardy to sketch, and he was fascinated by his West of Wessex girl, as he called her.
He opened the door of the west to me, with his loud steam lappings, and cliffside crashings of waters white with rain.
It's also different from the Saxon Wessex, which was Hardy's homeland. For him, this was always the legendary Celtic land, Lioness he called it. The sheer cliff face of slate and granite rises up higher than any other on the southern or eastern coast of England. Up here, we're 100 feet higher than Beachy Head, 3 times the height of Flamborough. The summit slopes away upwards, gently, green and grassy, among stony outcrops which are touched in with colours of thrift, sea campion, primroses, a few violets. Today, a pearl grey softness of cloud adds a touch of mystery. It's a scene to stir the most sluggish imagination. When Hardy walked up here in 1913, in the first shock of his bereavement, he was overwhelmed with emotions which stirred the deepest springs of his poetry, and in poem after poem he poured out a moving lamentation, and none of them, I think, finer than the one that he entitled Beanie Cliff, and then he wrote under the title the dates: March 1870, March 1913, the occasion when he first came here with Emma, and the occasion now, alone.
Oh, the opal and the sapphire of that wandering western sea, and the woman riding high above with bright hair flapping free, the woman whom I loved so, and who loyally loved me. The pale muse planed below us, and the waves seemed far away in a nether sky, engrossed in saying their ceaseless babbling say, as we laughed light-heartedly aloft on that clear sun March day. A little cloud then cloaked us, and there flew an irised rain, and the Atlantic dyed its levels with a dull misfeatured stain, and then the sun burst out again, and purples prinked the main. Still in all its chasmal beauty bulks an old Beanie to the sky, and shall she and I not go there once again, now March is nigh, and the sweet things said in that March say anew there by and by? What if still in chasmal beauty looms that wild, weird western shore? The woman now is elsewhere, whom the ambling pony bore, and nor knows nor cares for Beanie, and will laugh there nevermore.
Hardy's Wessex was written and presented by Desmond Hawkins, with Nigel Stock as Thomas Hardy. The readers were Pauline Wynne and Douglas Leach, and the programme was produced in Bristol